Hi everyone, welcome to the Brown History Podcast. My name is Essen and you are listening to episode 28. Our guest today is award-winning Sri Lankan Tamil novelist Anuk Arudpragasam. He's written two beautiful novels. The first one is called The Story of a Brief Marriage, and the second one, which was shortlisted for this year's Booker Prize, which is a big deal, is called A Passage North. I had a pleasure talking to him. It's a great episode. I'm really excited for you guys to listen to this one. I highly recommend you check out his two novels. They're beautiful pieces of work. Before we start, I just want to mention, if you want to support Brown History and the Brown History Podcast, and you want more of this and you want this to grow and be whatever it can be, then consider being a patron. All you gotta do is just go to brownhistorypodcast.com and just sign up, and that's it. So yeah, I think that's enough introduction for now. So let's get moving and start this episode. Here we go.
Have we started the podcast? Or you just,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
move into it casually. Okay. Wait, but tell me, what time is it where you are in Toronto?
It's 7 in the morning.
And you usually do podcasts at this time?
You know, all my guests are all around the world, so I have to suck it up and just do it. You know, like I can't.
Okay.
It's part of the hustle. It's
Thank
fine.
you for
No
waking up.
worries. I mean, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. I'm not gonna sleep in.
And you've been doing the podcast for a long time?
I've been doing it for I think a year now. I think you're my 28th guest.
Ah, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's just for fun. It's
But you
fun.
have a lot of listeners, it seems.
I don't know about that. I mean, what is a lot, right? I don't know what the podcast game is like out there. So
Yeah. I guess there's Joe Rogan.
yeah, I mean, there's no way I'm competing with that, you know. And there's a very niche crowd here, niche audience who would care about this stuff. So it's nice for me to talk to people who are a lot smarter than me and more out there, and I get to learn a lot myself, you know. So it's more of a selfish thing than it is anything else.
Right. No, but it does seem very fun to do a podcast like this.
It's very intimidating, and you know,
intimidating.
Yeah, because I'm about to talk to someone who's like, you know, who's done some great things, and it's kind of like, okay, who am I to, you know, I'm not a historian. I have nothing. I've never been to Sri Lanka, and here I am talking to, you know, the guy who got shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize.
It's it's strange that you. I mean, it's not strange. It's strange. It's new to me that you put it this way. I guess I don't know if yeah, I don't know. No, I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that's true. I don't know. I think all you need to do to have a conversation is to be intelligent and open. Right?
That's if it's a private conversation. But right now there's like, you know, a lot of people listening in, and I don't want them to be like, who's this idiot asking these stupid questions?
Right. But you think, no, but I mean, the people who listen to you are probably like people who know about you or who have listened to your podcast before, right?
Yeah, but I don't know what they think. It's not like they write their comments and their opinions in. It's, you know, on Instagram I post something, I'll know right away if they like it or not, and I'll know. But with a podcast, they listen to it and then they move on to the next thing. So I have no idea if I'm doing a good job or not.
You don't have anybody who gives you like feedback.
Yeah, but like, you know, there's always going to be nice people out there who say nice things.
True.
But I really want someone who's very neutral and very blunt and be like, hey, you're doing this good, but you're doing this bad.
Okay, well, if I can think of anything to criticize you with afterwards, I'll...
Sure, if you don't mind, yeah. Okay, but enough about me. Let's talk about you. You know, what's it like being shortlisted for such a prestigious award? I mean, I'm sure you have a lot more emails to answer now.
Yeah. What's it like being shortlisted? It's complicated. There's a lot of, I mean, it's not, you know, I try to have an independent sense of whether what I write is good or not. And to me, a mark of having like an independent sense of value is that when somebody praises you, you'd be no more joyed than you would be sad when somebody criticizes you. It's a mark for me of some kind of independence in how I how I write and how I judge writing. That there are people obviously I trust and whose opinions I care about, but I try not to let people from outside that sphere have a strong impact on what I think. And so, like, I think this is just my attitude in general. So I think with any kind of prize or any kind of recognition, it's nice. It's very obviously at some level. It's always nice to be congratulated or to be praised.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I don't know. For me, the achievement was in writing the book, and that was something I did over 5 years, and I finished 2 years ago, and I was pleased with myself, and I felt proud of myself for what I did. And so, nothing that comes afterwards, because I spent a lot of time with that book. I knew, with this book,
Yeah.
I knew. I mean, I know it inside out. I can like quote entire pages. I've lived in it for so long. So at that point, at the point of finishing it, nothing that other people say should make me happier or sadder, or
Yeah.
make me feel like I've achieved more. I haven't achieved more in virtue of uh, some external body in a foreign country recognizing me than I did when I finished my novel and submitted it.
I really enjoyed reading books. I really enjoyed reading your book, both of them. And for me, doing this podcast, I get the experience of reading the book and then talking to the author. But in this case, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I'm not only am I talking to the author of the book, but I feel like I'm talking to the main character of the book because and to me that's like next level because I feel like there's a lot of similarities between you and the main character Krishan. Am I right on saying that?
um
Because I'm looking at your Instagram and I see that you're taking both the same train rides. You're both close to
mhm,
your grandmother. You're both
mhm.
from the diaspora. I think you both visited the north of Sri Lanka.
Well, it's actually not true that I'm well, Krishan is not part of the diaspora, I guess, in the sense that
In the sense
he's
that he's from
he's
Sri
lived
Lanka,
abroad. Yeah.
but he wasn't yeah, I guess, but he's also not part of the scene of the war, right?
Yeah, and
He's
actually that's a
outside from it.
very yeah, it's a very nice way actually. No, I understand what you mean, and it's a very nice way actually of understanding what diaspora means, because traditionally or conventionally, when we say diaspora of a people, we are referring to um, that part of the community which no longer lives in the recognized homeland of the community, that live outside in some way. And in that sense, I'm not really diaspora, because I grew up in Sri Lanka and my family all lived there, and I spent a lot of time there. And I'm certainly not like politically barred from re-entering the country or anything like that, like which is the case for a lot of the Tamil
Yeah.
diaspora. Um, but on the other hand, we tend to think of diaspora in terms of a relationship to land, but if we are thinking of it, or if we want to think of it in terms of relationship to experience, and so, for example, if we think of the war, and specifically the last 2 years, the civil war in Sri Lanka and the genocide that took place in 2008 and 2009, as an experience, and in fact as an experience that is so like overwhelmingly definitive of our community. It's shaped psychologically and politically every member of our community, whether we experienced it or not. If we think of actually our community as being defined by that experience, then in a sense we can also define diaspora as those people not who weren't part of the land, or who don't have a relationship to the land, but people who were not immediately present at that time, people who heard about that experience secondhand or through other media. In that sense, which I think is an important sense of diaspora, I am diaspora, and I've been diaspora all my life, because
Yeah.
I've grown up outside this like constitutive part. So I'm actually I'm closer to Krishan in this respect. But I the reason I write fiction rather than not fiction is because in fiction there is always, or there should be, a kind of separation between the author and the narrator, right? Even if the writer is writing in first person, even the text is in first person, we know that we should not. And so even if you make an inference, we know that we should be careful about making inferences from the nature of the narrator to the nature of the author. And I like that distance. I like the fact that one would feel caution about inferring from from the eye of the text to the eye of the author, which is not the case with nonfiction. If I was writing nonfiction, then anything I say in the text, you should be able to attribute it to me. And it's not to say that there isn't a relationship. As you say, there's many parallels, and but I would say that's true for, I guess, any fictional text I write. I mean, one writes out of experience, right?
Right. Well, I mean, the first book was, it was very violent. It's right in the middle of the war.
Yeah.
It's totally different from the second
Yeah.
book. And you weren't, as you said, you weren't part of that experience. And yet you must have really taken yourself out of it and kind of imagine what it would be like in that situation.
That's true. Yeah, that is true. That is true. Although what I have experienced as a person, my own personal history, even though it's radically different from the kind of situation that my first book's protagonist Dinesh was in, I wrote that text in such a way. There are different ways I could have written a text like that. One can write a text like that, and like my first novel, and I approached it in a way in which my ignorance wasn't salient. For example, the main character of the novel he spends a lot of time with himself, and he spends a lot of time with his body, washing it, cleaning it, feeding it, emptying it, trying to be in contact with another body. And so, for example, when I was trying to figure out how to write that novel, or how to approach this situation that I have no immediate experience in, I immediately thought of what me and that main character had in common, which was a body and a relationship to the body. And so I chose to approach that entire novel through a kind of prism that actually one of the few things I shared with the character. So in that sense, that book is also from experience.
True, because he does focus on the day-to-day, on the little things. We were talking about how in the book, we're talking about diaspora and what it means to be a diaspora. But for most diaspora communities, you're right. The definition would be more related to geography, but I feel the Tamil diaspora around the world is really marked by experience and not defined by geography.
No, I think that's true. I mean, to some degree, it can be said of any diasporic community, but also because we're such a small community. I mean, even between the island and the diaspora, there are maybe 3.5, 4 million people, and almost half of that community lives abroad, and it's different from say the diasporic populations of large of Indian communities or Pakistani communities, where generally there's always a huge population back home that culturally anchors the diasporic population. It's not the same thing among the Sri Lankan Tamil population, because the center of gravity is a lot more dispersed. It has a lot of different locations. One of them here in Paris, actually. There's a lot of Tamil people here.
Let's talk about where you grew up. What was your upbringing like?
Well, I grew up in Colombo, in the south, the capital of the country. My mother's from a village in the north, in Jaffna, and my father's also originally from the same village, but he grew up in a small town outside Colombo because of his father's work. So I grew up in what I would call in the dominant caste community, and in virtue of that, I was, I guess, what you'd call middle or upper middle class. But at some point, we, over the course of my childhood, we moved from that to what would be called the new rich. And so I went to most of my education in Colombo was in an English school, in an international school, and it was among the newly wealthy, I would say, people with a lot of money and very little access is not the right word, but very little interest in culture or in history or in art. And I don't know. It was Colombo during the war, which means there was not a lot of movement.
Did you feel the effects of the war?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, there was security everywhere. There were every 100, 200 meters, there were military checkpoints, and my my mother didn't like me leaving the house alone, or especially in the evenings or at night, because you'd be stopped, and if you were Tamil, they'd check your ID and they'd ask you unnecessary questions, and it could lead to trouble, and you had to be careful. So I spent a lot of time on my own at home, and I think that was how I started reading in my teens, just kind of also partly as a response to not being able to move around so freely in Colombo during that time.
And how did you get into writing?
In a kind of roundabout way, I didn't really read that much, very much, as a adolescent or as an early teen. But I think around the age of 15 or 16, actually, it's a funny story. I watched a film called Alexander. I don't know if I don't know if you've seen
Is
it.
this with Colin Farrell?
Yeah. So it's with Colin
And
Farrell
Angelina
as
Jolie, yeah.
Angelina Jolie as Alexander's mother, Jared Leto as Alexander's lover. It's really
Yeah.
got a star-studded cast, and Anthony Hopkins as Aristotle, Alexander's teacher. And I guess I was a young boy, and I was very much fascinated by these themes of manliness and the search for glory, and the idea of having a place in history. But I was also I was a very slender boy, and not very physically assertive. I was quite short until like relatively like late in my teens when I shot up. But I think these physical factors maybe contributed to a sense that I wasn't cut out to be an Alexander. And so the next most obvious kind of like mark of greatness in that film. It was a very bad film. I watched it recently.
It was.
It was a really bad film. And the next most obvious kind of role model, and a slightly more plausible one for me, was Anthony Hopkins as
Aristotle.
Aristotle. So I must have been 14 or 15. So there's a bookshop in Colombo close to where I live, and they stock a lot of Penguin classics, and they had a little philosophy section. So the next time I was there, I saw the philosophy section, and I saw Aristotle, and I got a bunch of other books, maybe 5 or 6 philosophy books, um, Descartes, Wittgenstein, Plato, and I took them home and I tried to read them, and I wouldn't have read them all. I would have tried to read them all, and I would have finished one or two, and I probably would not have understood like a great deal. But this was what really started me uh, in reading, this interest in philosophy, and this interest that like this idea that through philosophy, I could somehow transcend everydayness, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. And then you went into philosophy and you pursued it academically.
Yeah, and then I studied philosophy. I studied in the US for my undergraduate, and I did philosophy, and then I went on to do a PhD too in the subject. But by the time I was starting my PhD, I decided I would like to be a writer and not a philosopher, because by that time I understood that philosophy, as it was done in the past in Greece or in Rome in the Western tradition, was very different from how people do philosophy in American universities or English universities. It's very much an academic or a scholarly discipline now. It's not given to grand claims or to kind of like bold assertions. It's very modest. It's very technical. It's very logical and rigorous. And I felt there was no room to like really think about questions of life. And that was something I thought I could do in writing. And so it was like after I had really immersed myself into philosophy, really, that I began to think of writing as something that I could express myself intellectually uh, a lot more fruitfully through.
What was your, most of the philosophy, all the books, all the great books are all by, white people and Europeans
Mm-hmm.
and Americans. What was your relationship with what was it like for you to enter a world of white men coming from your culture and your background and being a person of color?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I guess I mean when I was young, I didn't think of myself as a person of color. Person of color is an American category, right, or a North American category. I thought of myself as Tamil. Um, I mean, of course, in our country, I mean, there are all sorts of hierarchies in our part of the world that have nothing to do. I mean, they might have a little to do with color, but they run much more along the lines of race and of caste and of religion. And so I saw myself, I identified myself racially first and foremost. So
Okay.
as a Tamil person. But I also, I think when you're young, you don't tend to think about these things, obviously. So everything is I don't know. I mean,
When I was young, I remember trying to read Plato and all these books. I had a similar phase, and I was like, I don't know, 13, 14 in the library.
mm,
And obviously, I didn't know what was going on, but I just felt that whatever these people were saying didn't include my religion and my culture and my
mm,
background, and I couldn't fit who I was with what was being said together. It just felt
yeah,
like it's a conversation that I'm not included in. So I was wondering
yeah.
if you had this
You
kind of
know,
feeling too.
yeah. It's interesting. I mean, in a way, in a way I feel like, I mean, I studied in English, right? And so if you speak the English language, you are automatically I feel like in a very like intimate and profound way, uh, you are inculcated into the Western tradition. Even the concepts, the philosophical concepts in English, come out very organically of the Western philosophical tradition as opposed to non-Western philosophical traditions. So I feel in virtue of English also, simply the fact that I could speak English, I wasn't like so far removed. But there were obviously things, right? So for example, I remember I read Descartes, and he's a 17th century, I believe, French philosopher, and he wrote a lot about the
Yeah.
mind and the distinction between the mind and the body, and also about God. And he has an argument in his book Meditations on the First Philosophy on the existence of God. And I was raised as a Saivite. I was raised as a as a as a Shiva worshipping, or like a Hindu. But when I read the Descartes argument for the existence of God, I didn't actually stop to think, oh, he's talking about a Abrahamic God. He's talking about really the qualities he's ascribing to God really fit much more within the Abrahamic tradition. They could be seen much more easily as an argument for the existence of a Christian God or an Islamic God. But like the conceptualization of the divine is very different in South Asian religion. And so but I read the argument, and I didn't really have many critical faculties. Like I wasn't very critical of what I was reading at the time, and I was like, oh, okay, this argument really works. God exists. But then I assumed by God he was talking about our God, and so I kind of misread the text in a way. It took some time. It took me going to America um, to understand that like, okay, this God actually is different, or it's conceptually
Yeah.
different, and the argument doesn't work for any other kind of uh, framework for the divine. But so I didn't really see it like that. But then also, also a lot of these early philosophers, they weren't white, or they weren't Western. I mean, I think of Plato and Aristotle as Mediterranean philosophers that became central to what we call the Western tradition,
Right, right, right.
which is more properly the European philosophical tradition. But they were just as central to the Islamic philosophical tradition, for example. And they were certainly culturally, the Greeks of that time, a lot closer to uh, Persians and North Africans than they were to Northern Europeans,
True.
or the people we that are, I guess, we call white today. So yeah, so even that is, it's not quite true. I mean, certainly, like in the time of the Tamil Sangams in the early parts of the first millennium, there was trade, and there was intellectual back and forth between South India and Greece or in the Mediterranean. So yeah, I don't know. I didn't really think about it like that at the time. I think it was only when I went to university, to an American university in the United States, and was surrounded by Americans, and was studying and writing and talking in English with these other people, that I began to really think that, or really understand that, oh, actually, this is not a tradition I can lay claim to as easily. But when you're young and when you're reading and it's just words on a page,
Yeah.
I don't know, you don't, or I didn't. And also philosophy is very abstract in a way. It's not like reading fiction where you are constantly aware of the manners of speech, of the social habits, of the cultural milieu of what you're reading, right? Philosophy tries to abstract from a lot of that, and obviously it doesn't. There are always cultural and historical deposits in a philosophical text as well, but it's a lot easier to be unaware of those things in philosophy than it is in literature.
What is your relationship to Tamil literature like? You know, all your books are written in English and there's no dialogue.
I do write in Tamil, not for publication yet, because I'm not comfortable publishing anything in Tamil yet. But I actually just was writing a piece on the relevance of Wittgenstein to a post-genocide society as the first philosophical like talk or thing or like piece I was giving in Tamil. But I studied maybe 2 years of Tamil when I was a kid, and then my education was in English. And so it's really been only over the last 10, 12 years that I've really made an effort to learn how to read and write. And it basically had to start from scratch. I basically had to start from
That's
the
really tough. Must be
the
really tough.
alphabet. I mean, it's easy. I mean, it was easier because I speak the language and I'm fluent in the language, but the just learning how to read, learning how to write, and there's a big difference between the vocabulary of speech and the vocabulary of literary production. Obviously, especially in South Asian languages, there's quite a big divide. But yeah, I've only really been reading like reading easily for the last or reading with comfort for the last maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years. I've only been writing at what I would say is like a level of competence, like a level of like basically being able to express myself for the last maybe 2 or 3 years. But yeah, I think my interest in Tamil grew a lot more after my time in the US, when I realized, also for me, part of the joy of reading and writing is this sense of being able to remove myself from the environments I'm in. And actually English gave me that when I was in uh, Sri Lanka. But obviously English could not give me that because it was the language everybody spoke when I was living in the US, where I lived for 11 years. And so Tamil began to assume more and more this role of a kind of secret language or a private language in which I could express my desire to be elsewhere. And so it also kind of took on this aspect as time went on.
In an interview I read somewhere that you said that Tamil was a colonized language.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, there's a sense in which it's true for all South Asian and a lot of non-Western languages, which is that Tamil has, it's the oldest continually spoken language in the world, and it has like a very, very richest body of literary production. One of the richest bodies of literary production of any language, and especially in the classical area in the time of antiquity. And people don't just, poetry doesn't just come out of thin air. There has to be systems of education in place. There has to be systems of literary production in place. There have to be patrons. There have to be critics. There have to be stages and spaces and audiences. And basically there needs to be a complex institutional apparatus for any kind of sophisticated production in poetry, I would say, to be possible. And there was, obviously, because such a literature exists in Tamil as it does in many other South Asian languages. But over the colonial period, these institutions were destroyed. They were made illegal or defunded, or the economic and cultural situation became such that they crumbled of their own accord. And so at the end of 200 or 300 years of colonization, the institutions no longer existed to maintain production at such a high level, literary production. And so in that sense, it's colonized. And in that sense, the 70 or 80 years of so-called independence after the departure of the British has not been enough time for those institutions to be rebuilt and for like a really flourishing system. I mean, and that of course comes together with, I guess, economic conditions in general. It's difficult to sustain literary production at a high level when many people are struggling for food, or having to work many hours a day and don't have time to read, and so on and so forth. And I think that holds for a lot of non-Western languages, have gone through this process of having their institutions taken away from them. And by institutions, I mean even things like prizes or systems of recognition. This whole Booker thing, there would have been such things, prizes and awards and
Right.
forms of recognition as significant and
to
as
encourage
famous.
it.
Yeah. But today, no Tamil writer can be compensated or given adulation the way that an English language writer can. And it's because of the systems that exist around those languages. But it's true doubly for Tamil in Sri Lanka, because there's been a series of, since so-called independence in 1948, there's been a series of kind of anti-Tamil policies, of quotas to reduce the numbers of Tamils going into university, acts that were intended to delegitimize the official standing of Sri Lanka of Tamil in the country, and in that sense, and also in general, like the obstruction of these kinds of systems that could be that would be required to sustain a language and its literary production. For example, in I'm forgetting now, but I believe it was. Let me look it up. There's a famous library in northern Sri Lanka, the Jaffna Library, which was burnt to the ground. Yeah, and it was 1981, and it contained thousands of really old and ancient palm leaf manuscripts that didn't have copies, and that were destroyed forever when this building was burnt down. And it was kind of a symbol of pride, because also as in the Tamil community, we understand there's a real devotion to language
and culture.
Specifically language. Like the separatist movements in Sri Lanka were often, and even at the time that there were separatist movements in South India, in the Dravidian movement, but also in precursor movements in Tamil Nadu, a lot of political aspirations and ideals were identified in terms of language. Like, we want space for Tamil. We want a land in which Tamil can be spoken freely, in which Tamil can be spoken loudly. We want a land in which people can hear Tamil poetry. So a lot of political frustrations and aspirations were articulated in some way or another through this idea of language, and giving language space and room and time to grow. Yeah. So I lost track of what we were talking about, but
me too, but it's okay. When I was in school, whatever time I would try to write a story or something about myself or my life, I would have to include my culture and my religion, right? But my audience, my classroom, my teacher were all, were not of the same cultural background as me.
Yeah.
So when you're writing these novels about the war, about these stories of these people, was it tough in the sense that because in the book I find that when I was reading it, you don't really explain the historical, political context of what's going on. You're really focused on these personal stories, on these narrowed down stories of these characters and what they're going through, but you kind of leave out not too much, but a lot of what's going on and what happened. So anybody who has no idea what's going on, who's never heard of Sri Lanka, has to kind of do a little research on their own.
Yeah.
Did you do that? Like, were you aware of that, or when you were writing it, did you just not? You know what? Did you not have to explain yourself?
It's a different situation, right? Growing up in a foreign country or in a country that's foreign to your culture, and growing up as a diaspora member, than it is growing up in proximity to people of your culture, your community, or your homeland. And that was my situation. I grew up on the island of Sri Lanka. I had relatives around me. We couldn't actually access the north. It was until I never went to my like ancestral village until I was 20 or 21. But I have I guess that's my frame of reference in a way. And so for me, it would be very boring to explain Sri Lankan history just in the same way that like it would be boring for an American writer to I don't know, to talk about kind of basic events to explain like, you know, the Vietnam War or the civil rights movement. They wouldn't bother to do it. They take it for granted that the audience understands and explains. And I think I was my own audience. Me and my first reader was my sister. She was the person that I'd give all my reading to, all my writing to when I like even today, but when I started writing from the age of 20. And so she had the same frame of reference as me. And I wasn't really interested in other people's frame of reference because I always saw and continue to see writing as something that I do for my own sake and out of my own needs. And so it never occurred to me, and I wouldn't do it. I mean, the moment I start to do that would be the moment writing becomes about something other than me or where I'm coming from or what I want from it. Right. And that's very much the kind of attitude I have towards writing, that it's a personal activity. It's something that I'm doing for myself. Even if now I have apparently people who are reading my work like at a like a kind of like wider scale.
When I read a novel, I mean, you know, back in the day I used to read novels just for fun, but now as I'm getting older, I'm 34 now, and I guess I'm trying to find truth and meaning. And when I read a book, I want some kind of truth from it, you know. And you said you were in philosophy, and philosophy is made to kind of justify and explain things of life's questions. Do you find that when you switch from philosophy to writing, you found some answers to life's questions that you're looking for, or did you just have more questions? It's a hard question because
it's a good question.
It's your book. You know, I'm you know, I think we're both around the same age, and I just feel that life's reality is kicking in now, and we're at this age where, you know, the older generation is slowly passing away, and you're too old to be young, and you're too young to be old. And I read your book, and it's about grief, and it's about pain, and the reality of life, and it's hard to get through because it's really sad and it's really tough. And coming from a philosophy background, you're this kind of rare breed where you're a writer and a philosopher. You have this kind of unique background where your people have experienced a lot. And I don't even know what my question is, but I was just wondering, have you figured it out?
Well,
or have you made peace with the uncertainties of life?
I understand. Yeah, I understand your question. I think when one is younger, and if one is born into a situation where one has the privilege or the time or the space to think about these things, about the future, if one is born into a situation where you feel that you have some kind of agency or sway over what will happen to you, that when you're young, you do want to know what life is about, or what life should be about, or how you should live, or how you should organize your time, or what you should devote yourself to. There's a lot of questions about life that that you have, obviously, and this kind of search this longing really to know what the world is about and what your life can be about. This longing for answers or solutions in a way, and I think that was very much what drew me to philosophy, and it was also what subsequently drew me to literature. But as you grow older, you slowly begin to see how even little decisions you've made in the past come to shape your life. You have more and more of a sense of the kind of character you have.
Mm-hmm.
That character becomes more and more stable. If you belong to the bourgeois, then you've had an education in a certain area. You have that education has determined certain kinds of vocational futures, career futures that you can have. You maybe find a partner, you find a career, you find a place that you are happy or can tolerate living in. And so these decisions, they're often made accidentally, or they often come into being rather than being chosen, but they slowly kind of add up, and the kind of horizon of possibility slowly diminishes as you
Yeah.
get older. You have more and more of a sense that if when you were young there was still the possibility that the future could be radically different from the present, as you get older that sense diminishes. There's a sense that more and more you begin to feel that how I am now is not going to be so different from how I'm going to be in the future, at least in terms of my character and my way of seeing things. And obviously there are like great upheavals that one can experience later in life too, but that sense of possibility disappears. I think that's a fairly
It's a very
I mean,
impactful thing.
yeah, it is an impactful thing for people who are born with that sense of possibility or born into that sense of possibility, and like myself. And so then this idea that you could search through philosophy or through literature for a life that is completely different from the life that you live also begins to diminish. You begin to, I at least began to seek through literature or philosophy uh, more of a stance of acceptance of who I was or the life I live, or uh, the conditions of society than I did when I was younger, when I was more interested in radically altering my relationship to the world. It became less about transcending the world or liberating myself from the world or from my life than it did about uh, accepting my life and accepting the world. And I mean, accepting is I use that in a kind of ambivalent sense. I don't mean accept it in the sense of
Making
of
peace.
making peace necessarily with it, but I mean of recognizing it and seeing the power that it has over you.
You said that you went to the north when you were 21. That was after the war, right? What
Yeah,
was
the first
that? What
time.
was that experience like? Because I'm asking because the train in the book, it's a big part of the story where he goes onto the train and travels to the north to see. For those who don't know, the north is where most of the war took place. And
hmm
what was your experience like when you went to the north and you saw what happened to the land after the war?
Well, I was filled with shame that I had lived my entire life. I mean, I was aware intellectually through stories that people would tell and through pictures that I would see, but it was, we're a small island, Sri Lanka, and the north and the east were cut off from the rest of the island for 30 years. And
Yeah,
so you had no idea what it was actually like to be in those places, how the villages looked, how the landscape looked, the vegetation, what it smelled like, what people talked like, their vocabulary and their expressions, um, their relationship to land and nature and climate and sea and water and mountain, and also their suffering and the things that they had been through and all the losses they had experienced. It was happening right next to me, and they spoke my language, and we were from the same community, but I was sundered for all my life. And I was living a relatively comfortable and happy and privileged and carefree life. And to the extent that a Tamil person could in my country, I was living such a life. And I felt great shame, in the same way that you could be living in an apartment for many years, and then suddenly notice the absence of your neighbor for a few months, and then learn like months later that the neighbors passed away, or the neighbors died, or the neighbor was sick. And you realize, well, I was going about my whole life in this apartment, while right next door to me there were these scenes of suffering, and you feel a certain kind of or maybe a better analogy is when you find out that someone close to you has died uh, after a delay, like that your cousin or your friend. uh, we're also in the stage of life where people have begun to pass away for and I mean, this is something that happens if you're lucky as you get older. But learning that somebody has died maybe a day late or 2 days late, and you've continued living your life normally, happily,
Yeah.
doing this and that, going for a drink, dancing, meeting people, uh, having nice meals, while all the time this other thing had been happening. And when you find out late, you feel this shame and this sense of inappropriateness at the way you had been conducting yourself, while in fact something very different was going on, something that if you knew was going on, you would be responding to very differently. It was kind of like that.
Yeah. I understand. So let's go on to lighter topics. What's your writing process like? I'm always curious to know what's your process to an author and how he writes, because writing on a blank piece of paper is the most scariest thing ever. So what do? You wake up in the morning and you like have like a certain time set, certain music in the background?
No music, because I write. I try. My writing is musical, or it tries to be musical. What I mean by that is it pays a lot of attention to rhythm, uh, and so music would interfere with that. So actually, if I'm writing, I actually don't listen to music until I'm done writing for the day. I hardly listen to music in the mornings. But um, yeah, usually there's no set time. Usually it's late morning, afternoon, early evening, sometimes in the night. But I don't have the fear of the blank page, because I hardly ever leave. I don't let the page be blank.
Wow,
I
that's deep.
well, I think of it more, in the way that a sculptor would work already with a mass of clay. They would have the clay, and then the sculpture would be made out of that. They don't start with a void or a blank. And so I also like to begin with my clay. So I don't begin with a void. And my clay is something that I have generally a sense of what I'm writing about and what I'm interested in. And I simply write often. Simply write. I write around the material in all sorts of ways that come to me, and I don't really stop to think very much. Uh,
You
I
don't
mean, my
think,
process.
you just go with the flow. You just let the brain.
No, I do think. I think a lot. I'm always thinking, and so what I mean to say is that I don't, I don't, I don't plan much, and I'm specifically saying in response to this problem of the blank page. Uh, I I I eliminate that by I always write so that I have material, and once I have some basic material, whether some of it is good, some of it is bad, the sentences won't be nice. From that, I expand. I look at what I have, so I make sure that I'll have something first, and I won't give it too much attention. So I won't be agonizing over whether it's good or bad, or whether it's a suitable basis for a book or a text. I just put it down, and then I'll work from that. I'll I'll take certain bits away, and certain bits I'll begin to expand on and elaborate on, and I'll go over the text. I go over the text hundreds of times, any text, any chapter, any paragraph, any sentence, and with every single well, there's two ways that you can think about it. There are two natural processes that I sometimes think about in relation to writing. um, do you know how I actually don't know if this is geologically and geographically accurate, but do you know uh, how a spit forms in the ocean?
A spit
How
forms?
Yeah, no, spit, as in a spit is a geological landform. It's a kind of projection from the coast of a kind of like line of sand out into the distance. But the coastline
Yeah.
is shaped in different ways. No, it isn't straight.
No.
And when waves come in, they deposit material, right? And the way they deposit material is not even. They deposit more material in some areas and less material in other areas, and it depends on the kind of shape or material, or the kind of the nature of the coastline at certain points, whether the sea will be depositing more or less in a specific area. But the point is that there are certain points, because of uh, uh, on the coastline, along the beach, where more material would be deposited rather than less, because there's something there that slows down the water or something like that. And so over the course of months and years and decades, coastlines change their shape by this kind of natural process of deposition.
Yeah.
Um, and I kind of think about, every time I go over the text, I reread and rewrite the text. I add a little bit to certain spots that for some reason slow down my thinking. And I'll do this again and again and again and again until the shape of the coast, until the shape of the sentences and the paragraphs can look radically different. And it's not something that, just like the sea is not thinking, it's not like I am thinking, but I'm slowed down at certain points and I'll add something. And the same way, I'll take certain things away. And for this, I think of in the Sahara Desert or in the Gobi Desert, you have these landforms that are shaped by the attrition of the wind over thousands of years into
Yeah.
these really strange and beautiful and smoothly polished shapes, right? Alien kind of landscapes. And that's just the process of wind, and the process of the wind eroding the little grit, the little bits of sand and rock particles that the wind is carrying, striking against the rock form. And again, the wind doesn't think to create these shapes, these beautiful shapes, but it works with the material. Softer parts of the rock form are chipped away, and the sturdier parts less so. And over time, again, these like really strange and profound landscapes are formed. And so I think of it in that way. I go over the text again and again and again and again. I'll make small changes, small additions, and small subtractions, depending on where I'm meeting resistance, or where the text is slowing me down, kind of like the wind or the sea.
How do you know you have a story then, right? How do you know, right? Because your last book, nothing. There's not much happening. It's really more
Mm-hmm.
about the mind and what he's thinking and what he's observing. But the story is very simple. So how do you know you have a story here? And do you first think of the ending first so you know where you're going, or do you just write the beginning and then kind of hopefully find your way somewhere?
I think it depends. It depends on the text. It depends on the text. Like with what I'm writing now, the novel I'm writing now, I don't really know the ending. My second novel, because there's no real story, I knew the ending, which was going to be relatively unsurprising and relatively uneventful.
Mhm.
But I don't really think about stories. I like stories. I like telling stories. I like listening to stories. I like all kinds of stories, but I don't. Stories are not what I go to literature for. I'm much more personally interested in maybe what you could call situations rather than stories.
Okay.
Uh, an individual in a situation in which something has happened, or that there's certain kind of pressure on them, or certain kind of demands on them, and I'm more interested in exploring um, the impact of the situation on the psyche of the character, on their moods, on the way they perceive things, on their understanding of their relationship to the world. I take a situation. So in this last book of mine, A Passage North, uh, a woman that the main character knows has passed away
Yeah.
in a way that looks like it could be suicide, and that's how the book starts. And all that happens is that the main character Krishan takes a train from his home in Colombo and goes to the north and is present attends the funeral. Nothing else happens, but it's a situation in
Yeah.
which
There is a lot going on
yeah,
in the background. But if you say it like that, it sounds really simple. But there is so much happening and has happened
yeah,
that it's a really heavy journey.
yeah, yeah. And so the situation demands him to be present in a certain kind of way and to pay attention in a certain kind of way and to reflect about certain kinds of things. The woman who's died, the son she lost in the war, her relationship to his grandmother, who she took care of for a couple of years, his grandmother, her aging process, her slow withdrawal from the world, the friendship between these two women, the war in the background, the genocide that left this woman traumatized, all of these thoughts, all of these reflections, all of these memories kind of come together as he's taking this train north. And it's not and there's no real story, but there's this situation that is
Yeah.
kind of a vessel for these thoughts and images and memories and reflections.
Amazing. You know, your book doesn't really provide me with answers to life's questions, but after reading it, it gave me peace. You know, like as all good novels do. And I always wonder why I get this peace. And as I'm talking to you, I think it's because you get a certain sense, you get the ability to be compassionate. And I think being compassionate and developing that provides you with a certain way to have peace with the things around you in a weird way. What are you
Yeah,
working? Go
I think
ahead,
that's
sorry.
true. No, I think that's true
Because
because
philosophy doesn't provide you, I mean, as far as I know, it doesn't provide you with a sense of compassion, but literature
that's
does.
right. That's right. Yeah, there's not much in philosophy that would encourage that kind of thinking about other people. Yeah, literature does. Literature does that, and literature also just gives. In life, there's so much. There's so much things. There's so much that we don't have time to care for.
True.
There's the suffering of our neighbors or people on the street, or relatives or loved ones, even that we see them suffering or we see them struggling, and we want to help them. And most of us, most of the time, we do what we can. Uh, but there's so much that we simply can't. We can't afford. We don't have the time to pay attention to other people's suffering. And fiction really gives you that. It really allows a writer to give as much time as they want to a subject matter, to a situation, to really pay attention to it, uh, to dwell in it. And it allows the reader to do that also, to dwell in a situation, to give a situation uh, and the people within that situation the time that they deserve, the consideration that they deserve. And yeah, I think it's one of the really wonderful things about literature.
For somebody who wants to learn more about the history of the Tamil community, do you have any documentaries and books you'd like to recommend?
Yes, well, there's a couple that I referred to in my novel that I think give a pretty good.
Yeah, there was a
I mean, they're
documentary.
very difficult. They're very difficult. The first one is not directly mentioned in the novel. It's called Sri Lanka's Killing Fields. It's a documentary by a British TV station, Channel 4, and it's about the last 2 years of the war, and basically the genocide. And then there's this other documentary you could watch, which you could find on YouTube. My Daughter the Terrorist, very unfortunately named, I think, but it's actually it's a very beautiful and moving documentary about two women in the Tigers that is talked about at length in one of the chapters of the novel too.
Do you have anything you'd like to add in? Do you want to talk about something?
No, I think we covered a
Yeah,
lot
we
of
covered a lot. This
ground.
was great. It was a really
Thank you
fascinating.
for thank you for reading the two books
Oh
and
my God, it was
for suggesting
no.
this
Thank you for
conversation.
writing this because those two books were honestly the second book is by far one of my favorite books. I just really enjoyed just the
Ah,
way you dissect life and things. It just made me most books, you're waiting for something to happen, but this book I just really enjoyed staying still
mm.
and just understanding things, even things I take granted for. I can go on for a long time talking about this book, so I'm not gonna waste your time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Take care.
take care.